Welcome to Playing With Inference, a podcast covering intersection generative AI and games. Today, we're going to do a bit of an overview of the space. We are a week after GDC, the Games Developer Conference in San Francisco, which happens every March. And as usual, it's a time of a lot of nonsense, a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of meeting with friends and foes in the industry. And I think we thought this would be a perfect time to collect our thoughts and see where we're at in this space and what's coming in the near future.
Yeah, and joining us for this discussion is Nabeel Hyatt, general partner at Spark Capital. Nabeel is a gaming veteran and former founder, having co-founded and sold Conduit Labs to Zynga back in the day. Beyond investing in games and generative AI for years, he specifically has hosted a dinner with some prominent founders in the space for the last couple of years. And so we're very excited to have him here. Welcome, Nabeel.
Good to be here. And these are good to chat with two folks who have been in the middle of it every single day. I'm just a passerby trying to meet with wonderful founders and look for investments. You the guys actually building. So wonderful to have the chat.
I'm super excited to talk through this stuff and hear about GDC. Unfortunately, I had to miss this year, so I got to sit on the sidelines and read all the press releases and read all the tweets and Blue Sky posts, but wasn't in the thick of things. And so I'm really curious for you two, based on what you observed at GDC this year, how would you characterize the industry's current relationship? And by that, I really mean the game industry's current relationship with generative AI, and how does that changed over the last year?
Well, I think we discussed this offline, Carl. I think my feeling is that last year, on one hand, there was a lot of expectations. So like, we're going to have all of these, agent stuff. But it was, so all of these agent stuff, NPCs, AI, but it was like sort of cordoned off from the mainstream game industry. And then the mainstream game industry was very much, no, not AI. We're going to do that. With the one exception of that, there was one talk last year with like Tencent that was such a juxtaposition because it was somehow the most popular talk, but also during a time when AI was not allowed, and it was like a generative AI talk by Tencent. So it was like this weird, maybe people are interested in AI. This year is different. I heard a lot less on the NPC agent side, almost none.
Yeah.
Then I talked to artists. I talked to, basically in any studio or game professional has some sort of strategy or some sort of thesis on how they're going to start using AI. And that's either because they have to keep up with what the industry and the market and somehow make their costs competitive, or because they genuinely think that it helps them be more effective at their own craft. It feels less hypey and more realistic in a sense.
Yeah, I think it's important to separate out that there are multiple GDCs that always go along. And my joke is always that I always like the Monday crowd more than the Thursday crowd at GDC. I've been coming to GDC for a really long time. And, it's by Wednesday through Friday, it's mostly console folks. And the Monday, Tuesday summit days, for people who don't know GDC, I'm always like, look, if you're looking for innovation in the industry, if you're looking for what's about to happen, you got to look at the Monday, Tuesdays. And, for a little while, when I first started coming, they had this thing called the Virtual World Summit, which I think went from 2006 maybe to 2012 or 2013. At various times, you had the Serious Games Summit. When mobile started to rise, suddenly, before anyone would talk about it on a Wednesday, they'd have like a Monday Mobile Game Summit, and that's where all the mobile people came, and they used to talk about it. I think if we're talking about AI in the games industry right now, we have to acknowledge that I don't even know if we really are having the conversation inside of the games industry natively as an industry yet. There was an AI summit this year looking at it. You would have assumed that generative AI had not happened based on looking at those talks. I think there was literally one talk that was LLM oriented. All of the rest of it was ML optimization stuff that could have run at any time in the last 10 years.
Yep.
And so it's still, for all of the hype and craziness on LLMs, generative AI and diffusion models is going off in the rest of the industry, and by a little band of brother entrepreneurs that are pitching VCs and trying to talk to publishers about how they might build things. It's not pierced, doesn't, for whatever reason, and we can talk about what reasons, it does not feel like it's pierced the regular and common conversation. There's a really, really strong amount of pushback, even more so than the games industry is normally pushing back against things that are new, which they have the kind of simultaneous two things can be true at the same time, that games historically have been at the advent of new technology and innovation, but that it is also a remarkably conservative industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I remember looking at the summit last year. There were actually functionally two AI summits, and one was classical AI systems inside of games, right? Like, how do you get your NPCs to shoot and find cover correctly kind of talks. And then an entirely separate that was more machine learning related and had some LLM generative AI. To your point, conservatism, especially in lean years for the game industry, definitely comes to the fore in those sorts of official venues. I'm curious when you guys think about your conversation, like for the conversations for the Monday crowd and the Tuesday crowd, is the sentiment like the way you characterized it, Ramon? I feel like it's folks starting to come around with, hey, this is here. We're going to have to deal with it. Everyone has to have a plan, right? And there's sort of the classical side of that where if you had gone to any conversation a few years ago, because of the focus on Web3 funding, there was the like, okay, what's your Web3 plan? And everyone had to have a plan, but they didn't really have a plan. They didn't want to have a plan, but they had their answer, right?
Is there money on the other side of that plan? I can come up with a plan.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, is it a case of like, actually, like how much of it is resignation versus excitement, right? Is I guess how I would frame it.
So I think that's a great way to put it. I think I heard more resignation. It seemed to me that, when the money was flushing, Web3, you had to have a plan, but it doesn't matter what the plan is. It doesn't matter what happens after the plan. It was just the thing to do. Now they're seeing it more from a strategic point of view of like the money coming. And I'm speaking from the people I talk that are more like work for hire that normally would work with AAA studios. So on the one hand, they would be more on the, we are not going to do AI because, art, the value of art and whatnot. But now they have to target beyond AAA studios because they have a lot less money to spend. There's been like huge downsizing on that end. And they have to at the same time compete with Chinese or Turkish shops. So what I heard was they want to use AI to be much more effective. And yes, also like to iterate. And there's some examples that were some level of excitement. But it sounded to me, I didn't hear nearly as much as hype as in like, wow, look at this thing in the future. And more of like, this is my way of surviving these turbulent waters. And it just happened to land right now when I can use it. More of, a lot of them are finding themselves starting their own studios, like micro studios or their own consulting shops. So this allows them to represent themselves to be a bigger team than they actually are.
Yeah, I mean, if we back up historically, you're trying to figure out where it is in the cycle. People have had a couple of years to play with diffusion models. The first last year, you really felt the I'm going to say this pejoratively, the gold digger class come out. There was the like, oh my God, it's a gold rush. I better go sell picks and shovels. And I had a lot of conversations last year with folks where I was trying to explain that often in a world where you have the substrates underneath you changing very quickly, middleware and dev tools is easily the worst place to be in the market. So if we're going to separate out for right now any of the conversations we might have later about how publishers are doing overall and how's the market overall and the rest of that stuff, just the nature of where AI is right now would tell you being in the middle is very, very hard. Where AI is, it's a really tough spot to be in because, if you're building a game, you're still trying to figure out where the fun is in AI if you're trying to build it, right?
Yes.
On the back end, the model capabilities are wildly changing, right? Just this last week, we had OpenAI release the first natively multimodal model where you could actually have images sitting in latent space and getting some ideas about the things that can come out from that. That's been privately available for a while. It's world changing, and there's no doubt there'll be another world changing thing. And I always think about, it's not that game engines or those kind of things aren't incredibly powerful, but you have to have some normalized straight that you're sitting on. Like the whole point of an engine is that you know what road you're driving. And, we needed a couple decades of games existing and for them to normalize into specific genres before you saw the rise of games. It's not just that the markets were smaller, it's also that the substrates were shifting too much. And I think to a certain extent, I saw less folks in middleware this year. It doesn't mean that's everything. Like startups are a form of exception. So I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to go fund some dev tools company next week and tell you why it's the right one and all that. That's the nature of this thing, right? We're looking for exceptions. I think the other The one positive I would say about trying to build some kind of efficiency-oriented company, which is really what an engine is what you said, Ramon, which is that like, people feel the pinch. If you're trying to make a pitch to efficiency and you have a cost center that can be reduced in a world where people have less money, then at least you would hope that people would be now more open. And I did hear from those who are selling those kinds of tools, I heard a newfound like, oh, they didn't want to listen to me at all a year ago. Now they're listening to me more. I'm getting more traction. I don't know that I'm fully deployed yet, but they know they need a solution. They know they can't compete. They still want to be a US-based developer, as an example. And so like we have to do something if we want to be a US-based developer. And so we're going to willing to experiment with these tools in a way we wouldn't have a year ago. I've certainly heard some of that.
I think it's one of the things we've talked about internally at Champ is I feel like we're still finding these new game design primitives as we're building and playing with these tools. And so building a black box tool to help with primitives that we don't even know for your core loop of the game is really hard because we don't know what we need and we need to get our hands dirty and explore all these spaces and stuff. And so I think to your point, that idea of trying to build like a middleware engine for generative AI games right now, when we don't even know what that means, is fraught with challenges. But then you see the sort of companies that are tackling elements that are not in the core loop, right? Thun is a company that we're pretty friendly with that does generative AI animation stuff. And so it's not part of the core loop. It's just, we're going to need a bunch of animations. We're going to have to figure out how to rig, do all that kind of stuff. And they're trying to build that efficiency. And I think, especially now as people are more open, it would make sense to me for a lot of folks to then start to turn to middleware, but then also that gravity well probably shifts to middleware, that we're not finding new game design primitives.
I think a little bit of what you both are touching is this whole like selling picks and shovels when you're trying to, or finding the vein and going it after yourself. The way I think about it is like selling picks and shovels right now is like selling matchmaking software in the 90s. There is the internet and there are games, but we don't yet know exactly what we're going to do with all of this internet. The incentive should be more on the finding those veins. So the question is, at this point, we're what, 2-3 years since GPT-3 and many after GPT-2. We've seen many iterations and attempts, small and big, on bringing generative AI into games. What things have actually shown some promise in gameplay terms, let alone financial success? But what loops have been working? Anything that you guys think shows promise as a distinct thing that generative AI allows versus just a cheap way of doing something we could do before?
Yeah, I think to your point, it's been a couple of years and I think we've started to see experiences come out, right? AI Dungeon is at this point in this very fast moving space, the great grandfather of us all in many ways, right? Like that sort of very classic text adventure hooked up to an LLM has been there. Suck Up came out last year. Death by AI came out last year. Retail Mage came out last year. There's still a bunch of games that have been announced but haven't necessarily come out. I know that there's a couple folks pursuing more sort of narrative and story games. There's a couple of folks pursuing life sim, like The Sims, but every sim has a rich history that you can go into because it's hooked up to LLMs. And so there's a lot of stuff being played within the space. My sort of reaction is I think we're starting to see people move beyond chatbot, which feels really good to me, right? I think there's a lot of room for stuff that isn't just talk to an NPC forever, which is where everyone starts, and like no shade on where everyone starts, but how do we move past that? We see a lot more summarization. We see a lot more, how is it the arbitrator of actions and how does it create responsive gameplay is how a lot of people talk about it. We talk about it as like improvisational gameplay or games that play back with players. And so we're starting to see the hints of that. Ultimately, I think what a lot of us are pushing against is that we've been interacting through chat, natural language chat, which inherently means text boxes, which is, I think, a limiter in some of this, or voice to text, which is a limiter in this, or has been a limiter in this, though more and more voice models are getting better. And so maybe that comes of age and that lines up with what a lot of enterprise development is happening. So I think we're starting to see stuff that is really interesting to us, but I am curious, like I have probably a pretty broad view because I'm really in the space, but a relatively narrow view because most of my time I'm spending digging for veins and looking at rocks. But that's what I'm starting to see on the sides.
Yeah, I think we need to separate two discussions because there are, just to draw a very bright line, there are folks, maybe there's three big buckets that we can talk about. I think there are folks that are trying to use AI to create efficiency gains inside of the current industry or somewhat augment the game a little bit, right? And I actually put, sometimes it's efficiency, sometimes it's better gameplay. I put most of the AI NPC middleware companies into this camp. If you're just trying to make my $500 million game have a better person at the store who has a better backstory, that might be more immersive and it might be more helpful for me. That's not trying to change the games industry. That's trying to speak to the current industry and augment and make it a little bit better or a little bit more efficient and so forth. And then there are folks that are trying to build, I would say, augments to the current games and game loops. So let me take a category that I already know, like The Sims, and let me see if I can make it new and better. And how do I get AI in and around this thing? It's the plus one as a part of this whole ecosystem. And then there are folks who are trying to build like completely net new experiences. I would say in that order, it's probably a power law between 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the number of people that are trying those sets of things, which is true generally in anything, right? I'm a generalist investor. I love games. I spend all my nights and weekends on games, and we invest in games, both on the content side and on the engine side and the social networking side. But I also see a lot of other pitches. And the same thing is true if you go to a YC demo day and you see all of the 90% of AI startups right now, most of them are trying to speak to a certain industry that already exists. They're doing B2B SaaS stuff. And then there's a set of folks that are trying to do net new things. From my perspective, the interesting thing that happens that is different than what's happening in the overall market that's happening in games is the overall market is going through an AI boom. Like we can come back to games and we can talk about how people are nervous about the capital influxes and the constraints that are happening and the contraction that's happening in the industry, which gives everybody this kind of like lack of a sense of want. Like, you know, it feels some wandering the desert feelings at every dinner and every luncheon you're going to. And that's a very wildly different feeling from just the kind of little attitudinal approach to startups generally right now outside of games. And unfortunately, the thing that happens for founders, and I found this for a long time of just sitting on boards and frankly, personally, when things feel tough, you tend to get more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
You just want to win. It's not a logical thing. It's just got hard and you just want to win. And so you tend to shorten things down. In games, the shortest version of that is, screw it, I'm not making a game work for hire. Like, that's the most risk-averse behavior. But ironically, if you really want to build something great, as things get tougher, that's the time where you should be upping your risk valence, because doing the same thing is not going to get you out of this. So you should be doing things that are in a higher risk threshold. In other words, out of that 1, 2, and 3 segmenting that I did beforehand, I personally think if the games industry is tough, why would you try to sell tools into a contracting market that may never ship another AAA game again? Mm-hmm. Like there may not be another $1.5 billion Grand Theft Auto game shipped. And so that should in fact be a freeing thing. But I don't think the games industry has quite gotten to that. And I think it will be tough for them because the market isn't encouraging them to take moonshots. The market is encouraging them to just try and live for another year. And that's unfortunately at an exact inflection point in technology where that's the opposite that you'd love to see from the games business.
I 100% agree with both where things feel like versus the broader tech market. Like reading VentureBeat Games versus TechCrunch is this wild dichotomy of worlds we live in. I also agree with your segmenting of the three, and I do think that it's pretty natural for the power law to exist. I'm curious your perspective, or Ramon, your perspective on what I've heard is that a lot of the folks that exist in the more technical world, the generalists of the world, the A16Zs, the general catalysts that invest across all this stuff, and specifically those tech investors that dip their toes in games, have been pulling pretty rapidly out of games.
Oh, yeah.
Is that just like no one really understands what games are? Is that like, why is there that delta?
So I'll start from the high end, and Ramon, you can answer. You probably talk directly to more of those investors than I have recently. I often don't talk to them very much. The big picture is to understand that gaming has never been a major. It's always been a minor in the venture industry. I've invested a lot across a lot of sectors, including a lot of minor sectors, things like robotics and a lot of things in hardware and consumer. The business of venture is high margin software revenue, recurring revenue businesses, and it kind of always has been in some form. What happens is waves where once things recede, you don't get the credit of continuing to build. My experience has been that every single time a market goes through a little bit of a downturn, everybody in the venture market recedes back to their majors, which is typically some version of enterprise software, until there's some massive exit that happens. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that's right, I remember now. And then there's a flush for somewhere between 2 and 6 or 7 years. And then it all recedes again. And then whoever invested in that downturn is part of that, it's like Fortnite happens. And you're like, oh my God, you buy yourself a few years. And before that, it was like League of Legends happens. And everyone's like, oh my God. And then Roblox happens. I was like, oh my God. Like, this is the nature of things. And so we haven't had a major breakthrough in a few years to keep the ADD set who don't really have an understanding of the industry to not just, even if they believe, you have to imagine they are trying to keep their partners in line, right? This is an internal political theater in the longest lead asset class in the business. It's the unique thing about venture is this weird model of putting in a few $1 million and then figuring out whether you made a good decision or not, like 7 years from now. That feedback cycle is tough. Like, as somebody who has spent some time building a game where you can sit at a console and put something in and play it with your friends. Do I feel the spark or not? And venture, the reason it feels this way is just literally the nature of the asset class. The only other input you have into the model is markups. And for many of the large multi-stage firms, this is how people get promotions. They don't get promotions on making money. They get promotions on markups. And then the question is, who's going to mark you up in this business, in the games business? So you can get a seed round done from one of, 15 game VCs at this point. And then there's a handful of the mid-stage multis that when they started to raise their $5 to $10 billion funds were like, oops, games, we'll do those too. Largely as a receding from the consumer business. The consumer was failing. Arguably, the only two consumer businesses who should have invested in the last 10 years was Whatnot and Discord, and everything else you probably should have ignored. And some people could even contend on Whatnot. So a lot of this is people kind of receding a little bit or trying to figure out, like, where are the pockets of growth and interestingness in the culture inside of consumer, because I still don't want to give up consumer completely. Okay, let's go into games. And so you saw a rash of incredibly dumb money at incredibly dumb prices come in for 2 to 3 years. And then the question is, like, is that sustainable? And the answer is, well, what would make it sustainable? One is if there's a massive exit, which hopefully will happen in a few years, and then guess what? Everyone's getting flush with cash again. 2 would be markups. But this class doesn't have markups because there's no late stage private equity, pre-IPO, altimeter, Co2. There's a whole set of people in regular software that are going to write you up at $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion if you see revenue. And that's not how games works, right? And so it doesn't match to the ecosystem of ostensibly how people get promoted. Sometimes the answer is not macro, right? We talk about all this stuff as macro stuff. It's not macro stuff. It's micro stuff. There's a mid-level principal at a multi-stage firm and he wants to get promoted and he can't do it without a markup, so you don't get his money.
I think this sort of builds on top of, like you talked about one of you two, about how it's like a bust market in the games, but it's like a boom AI market.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like there's this, there was this flushy money 2021 to 2023 coming from VCs, and then it did very poorly, scared everybody out. And then at the same time, there's this hype. So even people who I feel would be maybe at the margins, just like, why would we invest in this when we can maybe hit another cursor for whatever, right?
That's right.
It's
There's a BATNA. There's a what's my other option? I could just invest in yet another Codegen startup. It's probably going to get marked up.
Yes. Okay. Great. On over there.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too. I like how Nabeel highlighted there was a retreat from consumer into games. And now because I read an unfortunate amount of TechCrunch, you see all these articles like, oh, the return of consumer, because of all this, these AI and these wrappers and this stuff. But also just in general, what you're seeing when you look at Newzoo and Sensor Tower data and all this kind of broader mobile ecosystem, you do see an equalization of people going into apps as much as they are going into games, whereas a couple of years ago, that was a wildly different thing, right?
Games is losing the attention war in a way that none of us would have said 6 years ago. Right? In fact, all of media is YouTube and Reddit are freaking out about short-form media. There's a reason you see YouTube Shorts. There's a reason Reddit is trying to stuff in videos in a medium that has no business being there. It's because they noticed that these things are going down too. And so, yeah, for me, the takeaway is you have to invent a new medium if you're going to do that. Like, why ride the boat that's just like slowly sinking? If you have a large amount of capital, you should be investing more in taking higher risk, knowing what's going on in this environment. And that doesn't mean that everything needs to be making a match 3 game or a casino game or something like that. It's just saying, look, like all of these mediums, the bar goes up. Like the bar for what a game should be to get your attention, the games on average are better now than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The games are better. We are better game designers. We are better game testers. We understand how to ship things. We could talk about whether there's enough genres, enough new things. But I would say, for me, my feeling, honestly, coming out of GDC was like a little bit of a calm before the storm feeling. Like we had a hype cycle a couple of years ago when it comes to AI and generative AI. Everybody's first instinct was mostly to do fast follower, Me Too crap. Most of that didn't work out, but that happens all the time. I remember exactly the same thing at Web3. Mobile was the worst. Now, that's it. There were some incredible companies built. There were some wonderful founders, but the number of just like, ambulance chasing idiots at GDC during early mobile who were just trying to do the mobile gold rush was terrible. Technology has a history of the best stuff coming out when it does feel like a band of pirates. And for me, like this year's GDC was the first one for AI in games that felt a little bit like a band of pirates. And maybe next year it'll feel more like that. And for someone who's very long-term oriented in innovation in the industry, I actually came away feeling a little bit conflicted because I was around a bunch of people that are a little morose and it's a little hard. And I have empathy for the process, but also I'm like, oh, these are the germs of where companies like Google get founded, where companies like Epic get founded. Like these are the germs of where really interesting, wonderful things come from, is when people dig down and they're like, nope, nobody's going to help me. Nobody's going to make this easy. So what do I really, like, if I can take a big, huge shot because no one else going to help, like, what am I going to do? And that's my hope for between now, say, and the next GDC.
100%.
So you mentioned something, or we touched on, competing against short-term attention media. And last time we talked at the dinner, we discussed how essentially we're competing against TikTok. These dumb videos of like races of marbles, really like random number generator.
No, Ramon, you should stop for a second. If Carl doesn't know, please explain what you mean by marbles.
Okay. There are YouTube videos of which I consume, not only me, but millions of other people, but we consume quite a bit of hours on it, of just putting marbles on this course and then letting them run. And there's a leaderboard.
You're watching marble sports. Like,
Yes.
Instead of March Madness,
Correct.
You're watching marble sports. There's personalities. There's like the crowd goes wild. The crowd is a bunch of marbles as well. I don't understand, but okay. Yes.
What?
If it hits whatever thing it needs to hit about you, great.
I have seen these things. I am not a connoisseur nor a fan. I do not own any marble merch, but I have seen these marble videos.
There's some game designer out there right now who's been trying to fine tune the latest llama model and like wrestling with trying to get the speed and inference right and get it to be able to make a good joke. Who was like, I give up. I can't compete with marbles. Like, I'm done.
Well, this is a competition, right? And it seems to me that it's either a single attention land grab, and then it's, whoever can hit dopamine at the lowest cost wins, cost being money and attention that you have to devote. Or there's like actual genuinely different markets of attention. And in that case, if that's the truth, those is where, when you were talking about completely new experiences, those are like where I think these AI game startups should be trying to go for. So the question for you guys is like, what are those other attention land grabs, if they exist, or is it just a single, just dopamine maximizer attention?
Yeah. I think I have a counter view to the colloquial sort of statements around this. I don't think it's just about dope, right? I do think that TikTok is big because it is more social than YouTube and it is more participatory than YouTube. What I think drives TikTok, and you can see this because there's a lot of creators on TikTok who actually hate TikTok, because TikTok is not favorable to individual creators. It is favorable to trends. It is favorable to, hey, I made the version of this dance and I sent it to my high school friend group and we had a lot of fun with it. And maybe it takes off, maybe it doesn't, but it's actually about that social participation of anyone feels like they can pick it up and participate in the zeitgeist at a given moment. And yeah, that's dopamine, but it's a very particular social version of dopamine that I think is way more compelling than the Marvel videos aren't great because it's become this whole like, there's fans and they're, I wear the Marvel merch and like, there's a spectator and everyone's in on the joke and then they submit ideas and then they feel like they've contributed to it. And you can see this evolution in YouTube too of how creators have become more about engaging their fans and reacting to what fans are doing. And you see this in games too, where what's winning in games is the more social it is, the more it's a bunch of friends nerding around and telling their own stories, the bigger it does, right? Schedule One, Repo are the hits du jour, right? Lethal Company Among Us before that, everything on Roblox, GTA roleplay has been this weird, persistent force for so long. My personal belief is, in the short term, dopamine attention can win. In the long term, it's about social participation that builds community, and that's what's going to.
The slot that I would talk about, to use the frame TikTok, if we're just trying to find out like where the experimentation should go, where is user attention going? I think about the world of interactive TV. So for many years, I had a bunch of entrepreneur friends that would come up every single year and talk about how they'd finally found some technical breakthrough or whatever, and now you can get in. And it like literally goes back to when I was like 19 years old, up through Apple TV, trying this with Apple TV games. And the fundamental like thing that people didn't understand is that when I'm watching TV, it's a lean back experience, like a lean back experience. And when I'm playing a game, it's a lean forward experience. And as you were intimating, Carl, I agree with you. We have to just ask, like, what is the thing trying to do for the person? And are these the same mediums or are they different mediums? And what I find, I'm not a big TikTok person, but what I find when I talk to my son about it, who is a big TikTok person, is that it sits closer to games than it does to television. And that's a thing I think people miss. It is similar to a match 3 game or a casino game. It's not everything that some super high skilled esport League of Legends game is, but it is getting you into a semi flow state. It's not challenging at all, but it's engaged. You are like the most mild form of actually lean forward engaged, because you're only going to watch it for a couple minutes and then you're deciding whether you're going to go again. The whole time you're watching it, you're going through this cognitive process of, am I done? Am I done? There's no failure state, but it's not that different from playing Animal Crossing. It's not that different from any other no failure state games. It is certainly in that ilk, and they just found a better medium. And I think it's important for folks to understand that. I think generally mediums find their normative value, and then those are the things you're competing with. And that is the thing that as game makers, founders are competing with today. And I think the tool sets inside of generative AI, we talk about generative AI as this big, huge thing. We're talking about generative AI is valuable in 3D generation, texture generation, asset management, full world building and narrative building, characters, animations, audio, video. We're talking about like a huge disruptive voice. I could literally keep going. Like, it's an incredible tool for people who are trying to build games. It's almost in a way like too much, right? I know the answer isn't just you stick 11 labs inside of Grand Theft Auto and you have an answer and you've like changed everything. But it shouldn't surprise us that it takes a little time to work through how all of these things are going to stitch together to make something new. I didn't even mention the last one, which I think might actually be the way forward for the industry, which is Codegen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I was surprised this year. I thought I would see, given that what we have found from LLMs is that the two things they were very, very good at are text generation for the first wave of GPT-3, and then code generation really from the beginning of Claude, and still basically mostly Claude. And I was very surprised this year to not see more code gen companies. Ramon, did you see a bunch of code gen companies that I didn't know about, that I haven't seen yet? Also, can you send them my way?
I saw a cursor for Unity, which has its own, it's just not a one-to-one, because apparently Unity, you have to interact through the GUI. There's not like a file system that you have to like actually operate over. So there's some merit in that. And it's pretty cool. I saw, but the two things that that I saw that were interesting were not necessarily interesting because of the code gen part, but because of the playful curation, which is, I think, what it's part of what Codegen can bring from the game side. Like, before GDC and running into GDC, the big Twitter current thing was vibe coding. you had this level of like, oh, doing all of these games. I think all of these games are for me and for most audience. They're fantastic for the people who are doing it, right? It's like creating this crappy game is a game in of itself. And I think folks like
That's right.
Robot, I think WebSim is and taking on that. And that's a game in of itself. There's like a risk reward loop. Even when Andrew Carpati was describing it, is like vibe coding and that you remove all the tension of caring too much about it. And it's just another prompt, another like evolution of the game. That's really a game, right? Like it's a game at a playful creation. And I saw there were, so one that's Storycraft, that they were not
Yes.
really writing exactly that vibe coding. But from my perspective, from the AI, I'm not necessarily tinkering in that, is that they catch into that vibe coding / playful creation type of game. And then there was Nilo, which is trying to do some sort of like generative AI game engine for kids. And I was telling the founder, you should just, he used the phrase in his demo, oh, playful creation. I'm like, you should just say that. That's like, that captures what you're doing is very cool. You have kid laughing. That's a game. Make it your game, playful creation. I think that really captures the whole vibe coding. When we're talking about all of these, like the feelings that you're giving the players and which attention land grabs are you trying to compete in, I feel like this is one of those categories that are uniquely positioned to be like a new experience where you're not competing directly against TikTok.
Yeah, I agree that code generation, and one of the things I think a lot about is how you lean into what the LLMs or generative AI is naturally going to be good at, right? And code generation has obviously been a big piece of that. And thinking through that, I do think that there's a whole vector of ideas and stuff that I'm very excited to try. And I think we will see a lot more studios pursue. I know of one group that fits more of the like band of pirates that you're talking about, who is doing a lot more like, oh yeah, I gave up on generating JSON and I just have the game generate Python and just pipe it into the game at runtime, and that's been working great. I do think that there's a lot of exciting opportunity there that I think we're going to pursue. But going back to something you said before, the games industry is pretty inherently conservative. And so between that and I think what I've also seen is there's a lot of concern from a bunch of folks who have started to work in the generative AI space around like, how do you structure, how do you limit what it's generating, how do you keep it from going off the rails? And then okay, but what if it generates codes for players? And then they're like, no, like it triggers all of their conservative points. And I think that's what's holding stuff back right now. I'm very excited about the space. I think there's a lot of electric fences around that you got to make sure you don't touch. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity in the space, and I'm excited where that goes. Ramon, what you're saying is I feel like a lot of people who are looking in that space and thinking about that playful creation are thinking about it in effectively UGC terms.
Yes.
Right? Hey, how do I take this and turn it into a UGC play? Some of my question that I'll turn back to you that I've been really struggling with is the way I would frame where we're in games right now, and this goes to the attention conversation and stuff, is we're in a demand industry right now, right? Like there's only so much time in the day. There's functionally within Western countries, all the gamers we're going to get. And now people are just trading what game do I go after, right? Like you're not just going to find a bucket of new players necessarily. Right? So we're demand capped, but supply functionally unconstrained. And a lot of UGC plays are about like, oh, we're going to democratize game development, we're uncapped supply and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, wait. Supply isn't the problem here, right? Like, why do we keep going down this? And I'm curious where you guys see that. Am I completely wrong? Am I thinking about it in the wrong way?
I think
Or
you're
how
completely
different-
wrong.
Okay, great. Tell me, please do it.
We do not need, the supply of games does not need to go up. The supply, good games can always go up. Sure, we can always have good game developers making good games. AI will probably let us focus on, what if a 5-person shop could make a AAA sized game? If you just look at the number of large open world interesting games that are coming out in a given year, I think it's hard to actually say that the supply is enough. There's actually not very many of them. Are there enough good MMOs that came out last year? Like, no. And why is that? Well, obviously we all know, because it takes like hundreds of millions of dollars in 5 years, and it's probably terrible. And then I got to go with my friends, and all my friends are still like all the things we would say that kind of get relieved if it's 5 guys and 6 months, and it's like an epic, amazing, huge adventure. So there is a world where if you move the floor up on what excellence is by using tools, we don't have to hand wavy on a bunch of other things. We're just talking about tool use. If you can use tools to make bigger things faster and better things faster, then that artist is still putting their soul into it. And so it's still a unique take on the world. And by the way, as you reduce the cost of something, you get more unique, you have the opportunity to make more unique things in the world. So it's also a net positive. Then yes, I think on the AAA side, there's a world where the supply could go up and it would be generative for the market. In fact, one could argue that one of the reasons why the market is in contraction and has problems is because they've gotten themselves the same way that Hollywood has into this low risk cycle that won't allow them to take any risk, which eventually just gets entirely boring. So I have no reason to buy a new box thing because my novelty trigger is not going off. There's no wonderful new adventure to go on because I kind of already know what the next Civ is going to do. I don't need another Assassin's Creed, right? I just don't. But I think the other area I think is still supply constrained is that when Ramon is talking about it, and Carl, you were talking about like Codegen and stuff that feels like vibe coding for games. As you said, like, that's not really about how great the game is. That's about taking game development and the principles of being in flow, both on the making of the game and maybe playing back the game with a couple of friends. And you're turning that into getting on the offensive. It's a weapon against TikTok, right? I'm trying to make an activity that, I went around last month saying this a bunch of times and now it feels like a cliche. I just want making a game to be the thing that I would do 20 minutes before bed instead of 20 minutes after I wake up in the morning. And what I mean by that is like, I would normally, if I were to go out to make a big game this weekend, I would do it in the morning. My mind is fresh. It is a grindy activity. It is hard. I want every bit of cognitive things. The thing I do 20 minutes before is like you finish the Netflix show. You're tired, like you're spent. You've already had an argument it's at work. You're just about to go to bed. You're done. And that's when you pick up your phone and that's when you watch TikTok, right? If you could make creating a game the thing that slots into, and vibe coding is the right phrasing for it, that slots right into that part of your use case, I think you would find that there was like no ending to the amount of games that people would make.
I agree. And to connect to the UGC thing, I feel like the mistakes that a lot of these companies are doing is that they're thinking as like, we're going to make this UGC. You should be able to share, but I think no, most people won't play what other people are going to make. The fun is in the making. Is, you're just doing this silly experience and going to share it to your WhatsApp group and that's it.
That's right.
It's not going to be like the great experience that everybody is going to play anymore.
You already have the social built in because they're already in a Discord server with their 8 friends.
Yeah.
So you're in great shape. We already have an example in AI very recently of exactly this, right? You have a company like Midjourney, which gets to over 100 million in revenue very, very quickly on a very small team. And you talk to anybody there, and by the way, it's a bunch of ex-game folks that work there other than David. And that team knows their stuff is not analogous to artist tools like Adobe. Their stuff is more analogous to scrapbooking. Most of the art that these people are making, they're making for their own enjoyment. They are doing it for the love of making it because they actually like the activity. I think that paints a future more for that part of gaming, the UGC side of gaming. It is not, I'm trying to take Unity and make it fast, and I'm trying to MCP myself into Unity so you can make something. It is, how do I make making a game into a fun activity for anybody?
Now that you mentioned Midjourney, one of the patterns that I keep seeing is that I don't care about your Midjourney picture. Like, it's just an extra picture in the internet I could have found 2 seconds ago.
Yeah, no value. Yeah,
exactly. But when you do it, it means so much because you put all of that effort. It's your little pet that you've been working on. It has meaning. And it's the same for my fan fiction on ChatGPT. I have all of these Elder Scrolls fan fiction that I've been like working on. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to read it. It's for me to like get amused, right? And I feel like that's one of those in the discussion of like new experiences that freeform to an artifact that is yours and having that loop multiple times. That's a little bit of those experiences that's been gamified partly can actually be its own thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Why haven't we seen more of this then? What's the obsession with just what exists? Is it the same risk aversion that you were talking about, Nabeel? Or is it just lack of imagination?
There are 2 pieces of it, right? There is overall conservatism in game industry, which has largely been driven by the challenges that Nabeel and you have already highlighted of budgets are huge, number of jobs are huge for a hit-driven business. And so like the industry would be a lot less conservative if it's 5 guys in 6 months to generate a game than if it was 300 people and 7 years to generate a game.
Yeah.
I think part of it is also that the people who are most eager to play in this space are coming from outside of games, who are fans of games often, right? But fans of games tend to jump on the things that are familiar, whereas the people who are deep craftsmen of games are the ones who are going to be more likely to push the edges because they just have more familiarity with the edges and where to push, right?
So I fall in the fans of games coming from the outside to the inside, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder of how much of game design theory do I miss, in the sense of like when I come up with an idea, am I missing certain principles that allow me to think this is what I'm going for? But in any discipline, you have building blocks that you can use that are recurrent toward building a new experience. And I wonder if in this newcomers to the industry, if they end up trying to copy too much of what already existed instead of thinking from first principles. And what first principles even?
I think that's part of it, right? There's some amount of it that I think can be, I'm a fan of games. I've played a lot of games. And so I'm going to go remake my favorite game, but use my favorite technology as well. Like I just came from DeepMind. I know games. This is what I like about games. And so therefore, let me apply my technology to that without really understanding how games are made. And so therefore, not understanding all the deep opportunities and risks and everything else that's concerned. I think it can also be a history of games, right? As a fan of games, how much do you really know about the given genre that you're jumping into? And so how much do you know about what's been tried before, what hasn't tried before? I want to be cautious of painting with too broad a brush because I don't think everyone who jumps into that, I actually think that you're approaching the problem set that you're approaching with a pretty open eye towards what you're trying to do. Do I think you've played every single game that has included the mechanics that you're trying to do and seen how they have failed or not failed? No, but I also don't think you're going into it completely naive about it either, right? But I think overall, people who come in who haven't gone through the practice of building games before, especially in whatever genre or whatever that they're trying to do, are more likely to repeat what they're fans of than push new ground initially. And I think whenever we have a brand new technology that is emergent and making waves and think could be in games, the first wave of that, of the technologists that come into games, tend to do things that they know as fans of games and just apply their technology to what they know, which tends to be very cutting edge stuff.
Which is to say that people produce the thing that makes them personally satisfied and not
Yes.
much more. And the issue of games is that it's really fun to make games. It's not that fun, I don't think, to work in a lab. And so you better make sure you're working on a really good disease that you really want to make sure is cured, because the work is actually not that enjoyable. Making a game is great. And being able to have the power to take the game that you loved playing 4 years ago and do your small twist on it is an enjoyable activity. This is why you made the comment earlier that it's not a supply constrained environment. Like, it is a fun thing to do that leads to how much far do I actually have to reach to break through. And that's why I mentioned the feeling of optimism I have for the next couple of years is that usually when there's constraint and when it's harder, people are less likely to kid themselves about how hard it is to break through with something new. And you don't leave it and just assume that somebody's going to invent it. You have to go invent it. We do not have a new distribution paradigm. We haven't touched on that. But one of the differences between this and many of the other technological shifts is that this has not really come across. The last company I started was an eon ago, a social gaming company, which was really like in-browser, a small amount of in-browser tech we were trying to develop, and then really a social function where we were using that for distribution. And you saw several years of very interesting innovations of trying to figure out how that was going to work its way into gameplay. But that was like one thing. And I ran down the list earlier of like that. Really, when we say generative AI, we're talking about like 9 different things, 10 different things that we're all trying to incorporate in, none of which lead you to new users. Mobile as well, internet, like we're talking about many different sectors that had a distribution advantage. I don't think that's enough There are some in the publishing environment and some in the VC environment who, and I heard it a lot this year, if we're going back to, what was the GDC chatter, that was generative AI isn't going to be anything in gaming that's substantial or disruptive, because if it doesn't come along with a new way to get new users, then it's not going to do that. I would push back on that really strongly, because literally the fastest growing consumer company ever had no distribution advantage, and that's ChatGPT. Like, that just happened to all of us in the last 2 years. And by the way, the number 2 in that space is also over $1 billion in revenue. These things are happening. And so the difference is that those things like magically seared in your hand when you use them for the first time. Like, the whole reason that you asked me to be on this podcast when you come on here a couple of years later is because you had this light bulb moment for both of you as founders a few years ago, and you were like, whoa, like, I'm all in, right? That's how strong that moment is. I think most of the gaming AI companies have still settled for something that, quite frankly, isn't magical. It doesn't mean they're not searching. Settle's probably not the right word. Haven't found the thing that as soon as I put it in somebody's hands, they're like, holy crap, the way that we felt the first time that you opened up Wolfenstein 3D. And you were like, what just happened, right? And we haven't found, as a collective like set of founders and builders, we haven't found those things. The bar is super high. Let's not kid ourselves where the bar is. The bar is not, I'm going to take ChatGPT and I'm going to make NPCs run around and speak Simlish on a little screen and it all looks the same, right? I think a lot of the ideas from a year ago felt like that. A lot of the ideas this year felt like everybody realizes the jig is up. Everybody realizes they'll need something more, and they're working through the trough of disillusionment on what is the thing going to be. I feel that some of them are like, I think I feel a glimmer of something right there. I just need to pull that thread a little bit more. And that, for me, having watched so many cycles of innovation, like, that for me is the signal is like you're just around the corner from a couple people really breaking through. And hopefully that's the thing we're talking about the next time.
Absolutely. Let me dig on that. Distribution and discovery, which go hand in hand, I think have been huge topic of conversation in games. And I think your point is super valid of having watched how OpenAI and ChatGPT have taken off, and kind of searing experience, I think, is really valid. And it goes to an argument that you hear in games every once in a while, which I think different people have different relationships with it, which is that, like, if you make an amazing game, if you make a 9 out of 10 game or a 10 out of 10 game, it's going to win. That's your distribution advantage, is that version of quality, which isn't like quality in a fidelity sense, but is quality of like magical interaction that no one can. Like, did Breath of the Wild win because it was a fucking amazing game that no one could put down, or because it was branded Zelda and released by Nintendo, right? Like, and it's hard to disambiguate those two things, but they are like, those kind of experiences tend to win out. But I think there is also an existential wrapper around that of, is that now the only distribution method that works? So we all have to chase 10 out of 10 once in a lifetime game experiences? Or is there any way that the advances in machine learning and generative AI help us here, right? Are there other things that you see on the horizon on that distribution side, specifically within games, that give you any hope? Where, like, I know that often talks about, hey, we're going into a cycle where we're going to see more focus on distribution innovation, whereas, the prior 5 years have been content innovation. I'm just curious where you guys are on that sort of looking at the industry and journey and thinking about the next couple of years.
I would hate if the impression that I just gave to you, Carl, was that the answer was more polish, because that's not really what I meant.
No, I told that.
There are 3 vectors of 10 out of 10 experience, and let's separate them. There's art and there's science and there's engineering. Engineering, you could also call craft or polish. Engineering is the things that I know how to do and I just need to do them well, and with better efficiency, they get better. The things that are relatively deterministic, they're like how many levels in your game, they're how many extra things you can do, right? That's the thing that I can do. It's execution. Science is the things that I can test and hypothesize and do iterations on. And this is, I think, a lot of really good companies that are good at this are folks like Supercell, which is not really art-oriented, And they're definitely not engineering oriented. They're not the biggest games ever. They're not huge games. They're just like, they know how to be very intellectually honest about the internal tests that they're running on a game and whether they're working or not, and try the next thesis and try the next thesis and try the next thesis and throw out things. This used to be how most of the old strategy games were built, right? If you worked at Firaxis 15 years ago, like I did very briefly as a college intern, you know, that was the age of the 12-person shop, but it's really a core 4-person team, and they're just like grind. Certainly in the old school games business, you cannot walk into EA and find anybody operating that way today. The art side is shock and awe. The art side is just the surprise and delight. The like, I just have never seen this before. And obviously the stress in games is that we would all love to release an entirely new genre of games that has never been seen before and like surprise and delight you, and it'll be like amazing. But then of course, like the new is very hard to sell. It is also much higher risk variance, and it mostly flops, and like all of the things that are the issue with the art side. So what I am talking about, I was talking about the art side, not the engineering side.
100%.
It's not Breath of the Wild, where it's just an unbelievably, like, it feels like the end state of a genre. It's like just the most, like, as an engineering effort, and I mean engineering with all the love, like dripping love off of the craft that goes into that game, but all the craft that goes into that game to get it right. I don't mean that, because frankly, I don't think that's a startup's game. I think that's a large publisher game. The only thing they know is engineering, which is why they keep making games bigger and longer to get out in the world. And so if you just countervalence like that, you have to play on the art side. You have to take weirder and stranger chances, which means games have to start a little bit smaller and a little bit more bespoke with the idea that they can get bigger. And maybe that feels closer to, I don't know, it just feels closer to Minecraft than it does to Grand Theft Auto. Not to be another person on a podcast talking about Minecrafting a game, but that's what it feels like, right? In the beginning. I think there's a difference, though, between making a game like Minecraft that is supposed to be an indie game, that is literally a contained experience. It's just a storytelling. It's 5 hours and it's beautiful and wonderful, but it'll never be anything more. It is just going to be that wonderful nugget of joy that came into your life. And I am making an MVP. I have found a way to boil down this art experiment, and by this creative experiment, I'm going to see if it resonates. I'm going to find if people find it. I feel like, I'm sure you have a list of things you hate about it and love about it, but Carl, I think that's exactly what you guys tried to do with retail. Like that to me is a good example of trying to use AI, trying to bake it into something that is like, I'm not going to throw away 5 years of my life on this yet. I'm just trying to figure out it by doing. That's, I think, the way through any kind of new sets of innovative technologies, especially if you're trying to like simultaneously solve for two things. One, how do we best use this technology, which has an infinite number of ways I can probably loop it into a game loop? And I need to create my own distribution, like early access from Steam. Like I think this entire process of the Valve convincing everybody just because they say the right incantations that they're our friend is wrong. They're just as bad as Apple in every way, if not worse. A world where you have no advertising built into a market only retards the market. Like the idea that people are like buying wish lists right now to try and get on wish lists because there's no pure CPA, like it's a cancerous, awful place, frankly. And that's not by anybody there trying to be maleficent. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying by negligence, they've allowed this thing to become something that is a cesspool, unfortunately.
Let me capture what I'm hearing from you on multiple channels. You open with these three ideas of AI for cheaper and more efficient, AI for augmenting existing loops, and a completely new experience. We discussed how with this technology, there's no obvious new distribution play. There may be some on the headphones and voice, but let's leave that aside for a bit.
Yep.
And then you also encourage people in Twitter about, taking more risks rather than less during a
Yeah.
Basically, that what this technology is pointing at is you should put all your chips on that art magical experience burning, even if it's an MVP, but this like really genuinely art in the Nabeel, this definition of art experience, and say, fuck distribution. I'm just gonna I'm gonna do it bulldozing the experience of everybody.
But Ramon, what's the other option? Like if we keep talking about the games business, we're going to talk about the fact that the AAA business is shrinking. Does anyone disagree with me here?
I think everybody agrees.
Okay. So either you're trying to make a case back to me that it's coming back, like it's a pendulum swing. Don't worry. Like in 2 years, like EA is going to triple the amount of games they're making and they're going to innovate again. And don't worry, it's going to be great. We just got to make it through the winter. I ain't waiting around for that, and I would not suggest any founder to either. You're talking mostly for this audience about probably Western European and US and maybe a little bit of Asia that's thinking about building if you're listening to this. So you're also talking about your competitive set of labor with everybody else that's making games, right? So that's also a disadvantage. Okay. You're talking about a distribution disadvantage as well. And so the question is like, okay, what's the other option? I think it's just not coming to terms with where this market is right now.
I don't think I disagree with you. I think what I'm saying is I'm trying to distill all the different phrases you've been throwing around. And it's more like support and arguments for you're interested in this space. Go to big bets on something very artsy and ignore the distribution side for now. Like just make some clear, immediate.
Whoa, I'm a capitalist. No, it's being realistic about how you're going to get distribution. And that can be, I'm all for, like, it just can't be another pitch about how you're going to spend $1 million of your $7 million on influencers and it's going to get you there. Like, it's just not. And so one of the ways there is to make something that is on the distribution side that is so mind-blowingly crazy that you will tell, it's viral. It's just not, it's not social gaming viral. It is like, I will literally tell all of my friends on the street because it's crazy. And you can't get that if you don't try for crazy. That's the only reason that part came up, Ramon, is I'm just saying that is a path to try and get distribution. There's other paths. I think there's a whole world of secondary IP that is actually another very interesting thread to pull when it comes to trying to get distribution. Because one thing that we will see overall in markets is this world of fragmenting IP at the same time as you have this like coalition of like a gathering towards the Marvels of the world and a few pieces of massive IP. The same thing that's also happening in the TikTokification of the world is like lots and lots of micro IP. So there is a world where you go and find mid-level community sizes that are super great that you feel like you can blow out and you kind of like use that to get your beginning first community to get going, and then you roll from there if it's the best game. Let's not forget, by the way, if we use that, I used to use the Marvel example, like that stuff was C-class IP. That's how they got a hold of it, right? That was not Indiana Jones or Star Wars when they got a hold of it. The whole reason they were able to make, like, I didn't even heard of Guardians of the Galaxy before that movie came out, right? Like, the whole reason they were able to make this IP was that it was freaking comic books. Comic books are for nerds. If we back up 20 years, this was not tier 1 IP. And so I do think in this world there's other avenues other than just blow somebody away, but you can't be building without at least a plan. What is our idea for how we're going to get out there into the world? That's all I really meant.
Okay.
One thing I want to ask, which is probably parallel and separate to the conversation so far, distribution. I think there is kind of a history of folks going after games, realizing maybe they're not cut out for games, and then doing something alongside games that finds exactly huge success, right? Like we talked about Discord earlier, started out as a company building an MMO, right? Slack, same story, right?
Yeah.
In many ways.
We're investors.
Yep. There are arguments to be made whether or not various people have varying feelings about how much Valve is still a game company versus just the Steam company, right?
Yep.
So as we're talking about what is...
You know where I am on that spectrum without me responding, but keep going.
But like, as we look at generative AI and games and people looking at the generative AI space and wanting to innovate and come there, we've spent a lot of the episode talking about what the things that both Ramon and I are founders and going and doing. And you've talked to a lot of founders and folks who are like, I'm going to go find new games, new ways to make games, all this kind of stuff with this technology. Is there an equal opportunity, a larger opportunity, a smaller opportunity for folks to go, hey, let me not go and build a game. I love games. I love generative AI. I love machine learning. Let me figure out how to tackle distribution, tackle game discovery as my core innovation.
Carl's like, okay, so how do I get from where I am to Discord?
Yeah. I mean, I would like to IPO. How do I become the Discord?
What's my pivot from here?
Yeah, exactly.
How should games get out into the world? Like, if we could wave our wand, right? I'll give you one thing I really wish did exist, which is going to maybe sound a little weird. I think we need more middlemen in games. I think we went through a lot of marketplaces. The internet has gone through let's get rid of middlemen, let's build algorithms to solve everything. The issue is that most of the great things in the world started with the patron. the music business got great music in the 70s, and the weird movies that came out in the 70s were because some weirdo decided he liked that kind of stuff. There are definitely problems with middlemen. I can understand why we railed against them, but somebody who has a commercial hat on, who also has taste and is trying to curate something together, that's how we get stuff that's just a little bit out of the completely hypercapitalism norm thing out into the world. And by the way, I think those things have the better chance, to be clear, of being much larger outcomes on the other end. Like, it has to be a little bit weird. Otherwise, we asymptote to nothing, and people are actually not happier. Anyway, so with that as my preface, if you could wave your wand and we were all trying to think about how a game that you just released was supposed to get out into the world, like, how should that work? How should a random consumer find a game? What would be the way it's supposed to happen?
I mean, I think I super agree with you. You know, again, like maybe not middle men, instead middle women or middle
People or
genderless
things or
norms.
what?
I do like. I agree that part of the problem, my perspective, is that the number one way I find out about games is people whose taste I trust or people who I know very well.
Right.
And so that could be someone who is on Blue Sky, or that could be a journalist, or that could be, you know, my buddy down the street who's like, hey, yo, the new Monster Hunter is coming out. I know you and I both love this shit. Let's get on it, right? And so, like, my version of this has always been like, how do we help happen more and better and arm those people of taste and to get games out? And I think part of the challenge that, if we're putting on our philosophical hats for the moment, that we've run through with the internet has been that, especially in the games market, of that centralization of stores and platforms, where it's Steam, it's Apple, it's Google, and it's PlayStation. Some might argue Xbox, depending on how we're feeling about the market. But those ultimately are the stores, and then those stores, the only store that has any robust feature for me to help tell my friends what a great game is Steam.
Yeah.
And no one would argue that Steam doesn't. And I think that bringing that down, plus the falling apart of games journalism and all these other things, have created a vacuum. And what we've seen in books and music, and to some degree TV shows that have overcome this, is you have book talk, you have artists being discovered on TikTok all the time, all these kinds of things where you're starting to get different ways to, then that's done it. And part of what I struggle with and wonder, does machine learning have a role to play in this, or is this just a different kind of algorithm? It's just like, how do we help arm you, Nabeel, to connect to the people who agree with your taste, to help find games that they would love? And the same for Ramon, and the same for me, and the same for everyone, to whatever degree it makes sense. And which, to your point, is like a whole bunch of middlemen, like a whole bunch of people who are curators and tastemakers and stuff for their little micro communities that help just surface stuff. Do I think that is the one size fits all that cuts through the noise? Well, I don't know, because like there's a whole lot, like there's what, 14,000 games released on Steam a year or whatever, right? Like, that's still a lot to get through, and that says nothing of how many Roblox games there are. But if we amplify the ability for that to crop up, and we have the area where folks are more likely to be creators and are making their own games, and so those tastemakers might become the people who make the games or are closer to it.
This is what frustrates me. You gave me an answer that I kind of thought loosely you would give me, which is like, the right way to distribute games is to fall in love with the game from your friend who's fallen in love with the game, who's talked to you about it. There's some measure of, and by the way, friend, we can use even more loosely, right? We all have parasocial relationships with some online personalities. So fine. Like, some of those online personalities are our parasocial friends who can also recommend games. But not so much as it's become transactional. As soon as it becomes IGN, as soon as it becomes a streamer who's only reviewing games every day, it becomes their business, and now it's divorced, right? In other words, it has to come across with authenticity. My frustration, last company I started was a Facebook games company. My frustration with that whole arc was that we had in our hand, I think, the best way to get really great games out into the world, and then the manner of the way that both Zynga conduct themselves and the way that Facebook, and I worked at Zynga, so I'm culpable, but like the way that Zynga and Facebook conducted themselves threw that all down the path. We have not had a interesting social surfacing like full loop circle in and out of games on any game platform, I would argue, ever. And I do not count my buddy's been playing Civ for 20 hours on Steam as like a good, useful social loop. Arguably, the best social loop we have for games right now is watching your friend play on a Discord server, would be my argument. That's like the kind of like, I'm going to look over your shoulder. It's not the same thing, but it's probably the closest thing to the ideal thing. So if I was trying to figure out how to fix game distribution, I would be tugging away at those threads and trying to think about new ways to solve those things. Now, consumer social, incredibly hard. Cold start problem, super hard. Not saying it's easy. Also, talking one of my favorite companies in the world that I may show up to board meetings for and all the rest of that stuff. Like, they also have an app platform. There's also a canvas to play with there, so and so forth for everybody. I think the point, though, is that the industry is in an area of a bit of a doom cycle, right? The opposite of doom is curiosity. Like, when you are fully nihilistic, you just don't think anything is going to happen and you give up. And so the best thing to be encouraged is the opposite, is like, just try weirder things. It's as simple as that. Be curious to try the edges of what you're doing is most of my conversations when I'm talking to founders nowadays. It's like, I think you're thinking inside of this box, but maybe your box is like actually your box is 3 times larger than you think it is. And let's like stretch where you're navigating. And I'm not smart enough to know what the answer is. The only thing I can do is just hopefully try to ask a couple good questions on where you might wander. This industry is likely to, ideally for the little band of pirates, is likely to go through that thing. The other thing I'd say is like, I don't see, that I would love to see in the market, is we have not seen many AI researchers and actual deep LLM people married with games people. And if I back up to previous realms of AI, let's not forget, for instance, that Demi, maybe one of the most famous AI person in the world as CEO of DeepMind, started out in games, right? And he started out in games because it was a way to exercise the technology, but he was a true technologist, right? The person was trying to work on algorithms and procedural generation, and this is the way to express that. And so sometimes I come across teams that are really AI focused, and there's just like nobody's ever built a game inside of that group. And then sometimes I'd come across games people, and they're trying to get one step past prompt engineering. And one of the other things that kind of generally happens inside of new technology markets is that the vertical players end up innovating faster and they end up winning faster. And so it should not be lost on anybody that Claude can get coding better and can get something like Claude artifacts launched because they have control all the way from the model layer up to the application layer, right? And if you look at the early days of Disney, like, I'm trying to innovate on movie picture technology, and I'm making Mickey Mouse, right? If you look at early Epic, it's the same. I see a lot of hands-offness from folks who are working in games who are afraid to get anything deeper than the core game loop if they care about the core game loop. And I see a lot of AI people that are just like deathly afraid of saying that they want to make a game. Sometimes I think, by the way, those AI people, they're trying to say that because they're trying to placate a VC. So you may probably get a more honest answer than I do. I get a lot of like, don't worry, it's not hits based. Like, I have made an engine that will make all the games or something like that. And they don't know that that's like, that probably is something that some set of investors want to hear. But when nobody knows what the hit game is supposed to be in AI games, you're going to have to invent it, man, as we kind of had to earlier.
So I wanted to first say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and asking us questions and participating in the wonderful dialogue, Nabeel. Here at the end of the episode, was there any sort of last words you wanted to share?
I wanted to ask Ramon one last question.
Uh-oh.
Ramon, what was the most interesting thing you saw at GDC?
I have to say Nilo. I met him on a Unity, a meetup here in SF. And he told me I'm doing a game engine in the browser.
That's right.
And I was like, okay, WebAssembly, cool. And then I saw his demo at the Supercell event. And I told him afterwards, like, dude, this is like, screw all the UGC thing. This looks like so fun to interact and build with. Like he said during the demo, something playful curation. For me, that was like, it really captured the essence and really captured what I was seeing in different patterns with the vibe coding thing, right? It's what I think Rosebud should be. It's what WebSynth definitely is. And it's what all of this vibe coding. So for me, it was one of my highlights of GDC, what Nilo is doing.
For me, it was Midsummer. I think the work that they're doing, I don't know how much they're talking about it publicly, so but demo, but like loosely think of it in the category of Sims and AI and trying to think about what that genre is going to feel like. just a really polished experience that's probably not all the way there because we all have a lot of work to do and blah, blah, blah. But like really felt like a team that clearly had been made a bet early on the industry, had been working away and pulling a lot of threads. And I heard from multiple different people like, oh, have you seen that demo yet? Like there's just a lot of really positive energy around the things that they're doing and trying to expand the medium. So that was it for me.
Very
Awesome. If anyone has been listening and said, oh, that Nabeel guy, he said something really smart and I want to ask him a question about it, is there a best way for them to get in touch with you?
Search the internet. There's many different places I'm on. I'm on all the social platforms. I'm Nabeel on Discord. I'm Nabeel on Twitter. Thankfully, I have a weird enough name that I've got my first name on most platforms. Or my first name at Spark Capital. All of it works. Take care.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us on this episode.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to the full episode. We really hope you enjoyed the discussion. It would help us out a ton if you subscribe to the show on your platform of choice, as well as shared it with folks you think would find it useful. You can always check out playingwithinference.com to get in contact with us, join our Discord, or just find the links to the episodes. See you next week.